The EPA gave the green light to Chevron to start creating fuel out of plastic instead of petroleum. I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I think I'm smart enough to know that burning plastic is not good. I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjekovic, and we are unapologetically outspoken. Hey, everybody, welcome to Weird Wednesday. So, this is going to be one of those Weird Wednesdays where we go over weird stories in the news, except they're all going to be focused on climate change because there is so much weird shit going on right now that is centered on climate change, and the stories just don't stop. So I'm going to start with one about our woke Navy. So about a week ago, Fox News reported that the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, announced that climate change is going to be the top priority for the Navy. And according to Del Toro, the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps have been working on a climate and energy security for a long time, and they're now accelerating and broadening those efforts together. And he said, we view the climate crisis much the same way as damage control efforts on a stricken ship. This is an all hands on deck moment. So the timing of Del Toro's comments coincide with the Biden administration releasing a proposed 2024 Navy budget, which involves further reducing our already shrinking fleet of ships. And currently our Navy has around 298 ships. And for the past few years, the goal has been to bring that number up to 355. But this year, Biden is not only decommissioning 11 ships, he's only having 9 constructed. So we're decreasing our fleet instead of building it up because apparently the Navy is more concerned with fighting climate change in the Bahamas. And Del Toro claims that this is not a trade-off between addressing climate security and the Navy's core mission of being the most capable and ready Navy Marine Corps team, but is instead the opposite. Because according to Del Toro, embracing climate-focused technologies and adopting a climate-informed posture strengthens our capability to stand by our partners and our allies. According to Del Toro, climate change is the most complex issue that we have ever faced as a nation and as a species. And worrying about climate change is going to lead to new technology that the Navy can use to create a, quote, virtuous cycle of energy efficiency, cost savings, maritime dominance, and climate security. Now, I don't know about you, Stephanie, but I can think of several issues that we are facing as a nation that are way more fucking complex than climate change. War with China and Russia, perhaps?
Yeah, like the Russian submarines that are getting pretty damn close to our country. I might be inclined to buy into this climate change catastrophe if they didn't keep changing their story every few years. Like first they said that the world was cooling and temperatures kept dropping. Then the planet started getting warmer. So then they changed it and started calling it global warming, and that was going to kill us all. And then that didn't necessarily hold up. So now they're just calling it climate change because that way it can change all at once. And that just leads into their story. But that's the thing about the climate. It changes all the fucking time. It's cyclical, right? And all these climate activists like Greta Thunberg and John Kerry keep saying that we're all going to die from climate change, yet they're still flying around in their private jets all over the place. Or when someone is blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, causing more pollution than all the vehicles in the world combined. Or how about East Palestine, where the EPA decided that burning this dangerous chemical was the best option? Like, where are all these climate change superstars then? Like, they're nowhere to be found because they don't actually care about the planet. It's one big political agenda. Why? Because it's a way to entice fear and assert power. And a CNN employee was even caught by an undercover journalist saying that as soon as COVID was done, they were going to be talking about climate change because fear sells. And it's also about money. So everyone that is pushing this agenda is heavily invested in green technology companies, which, by the way, produce more pollution than our current fossil fuels. And I found this old article by a man named Peter James Spielman. It was written June 29th, 1989. And I posted it on our Patreon page. But it says that a senior environmental official of the United Nations said, quote, entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by 2000, end quote. Well, it's 2023. We haven't been wiped off the face of the earth. Then you have Al Gore and John Kerry, who have made similar claims over the years that prove to be false. And the big one that's going around the internet right now is Greta Thunberg, who tweeted on June 21st, 2018, that, quote, a top climate scientist is warning that climate change will wipe out all of humanity if we don't stop using fossil fuels over the next 5 years, end quote. Well, guess what, bitch? It's 5 years later and we're still living our best lives. So, I mean, I'm not saying that climate change isn't real. I absolutely think that the climate changes, it has cycles. And I also think that we need to find ways to improve and use less waste and produce less pollution. But do I think the world is going to end if we don't switch to electric vehicles? Absolutely not. I think it's a power grab by the elites, and that most people in this country will not ever think for themselves and question it. So, speaking of electric vehicles, what's the latest news on transportation, Tara?
Okay, so Stephanie, in Washington, D.C., there was this whole debacle last week over electric buses because Washington, D.C. is like one of the blue cities that's leading this zealous climate change agenda with their zero emissions public transportation program. Excuse me, sorry, guys. And the mayor, Muriel Bowser, she has committed to having every new bus is either going to be electric or zero emission by 2030. And the intention is to have the entire city running on zero emissions public transportation by 2045. And on top of that, she committed to making all bus rides free starting this summer. So logic would dictate that creating a new fleet of electric buses and then making transportation free might be a little bit costly, right? Well, apparently the city only recently came to this realization. And as reported by the Daily Caller in a press conference last week, Mayor Bowser has proposed a new budget that is going to cut the city's bus routes in half. So they're going to eliminate 3 of the current 6 routes. And obviously, this is because the electrification program has been, quote, costly. So, Stephanie, what's the point of a free bus ride when you can't even get on the bus because your route no longer exists?
Right? So, this is where the left is showing their true colors, that they are truly the racist bigots. Okay, so hear me out. What about all the people who aren't, quote, privileged enough to own a vehicle and require a bus to get to and from work, doctor's appointments, and the grocery store? And typically, underprivileged communities are the ones that are relying on public transportation. And you know as well as I do that if it were Trump or DeSantis cutting bus routes, they'd be called a racist, right? But again, she's cutting bus routes for the poor while all of these DC politicians in her city are flying privately all over the damn world. So it's again like the rules for thee, not me. So I have an even better one for you though, okay? You're going to love this. The EPA gave the green light to Chevron to start creating fuel out of plastic instead of petroleum as a, quote, climate-friendly initiative, end quote. To find petroleum alternatives. Now, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I think I'm smart enough to know that burning plastic is not good for the planet or for humans. Yet our EPA is like, hell yeah, great idea, petroleum alternative. So I found this article by Sharon Lemer in The Guardian. And she writes, quote, according to agency records obtained by ProPublica and The Guardian, the production of one of the fuels could emit air pollution that is so toxic that 1 out of 4 people exposed to it over a lifetime could get cancer, end quote. So that risk is 250,000 times greater than the level usually considered acceptable by the EPA. That's insane. But it's not petroleum, so it's okay. Right? Like it can kill everyone, but because it's not a fossil fuel. Then you have Linda Birnbaum, who is the former head of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, that called this level of risk obscene, saying, quote, "You can't let that get out," end quote. Well, Linda, it's out.
Too late.
And in January 2022, the EPA created a streamlined way to quickly approve petroleum alternatives as part of the Biden admin's, quote, "actions to confront the climate crisis," where they already signed off on using plastics. Their spokesperson said that the reason that the plastics were approved is because they're from waste. So they're recycling the plastic. So they think it makes it okay to burn these toxic chemicals that will cause cancer and are bad for the planet because they came from waste. What? Like, this makes no sense. Sharon goes on to write, quote, "But the agency won't turn over these records or reveal information about the waste-based fuels, not even their names or chemical structures. And without those basic details, it's nearly impossible to determine which of the thousands of consent orders on the EPA website apply to this program." And keeping this information secret, the EPA cited a legal provision that allows companies to claim as confidential any information that would give their competitors an advantage in the marketplace, end quote. So I posted this whole entire article on Patreon because it was pretty long if you guys want to read it. But they basically have this legal provision saying, yeah, a company can go on and apply to burn plastic as long as it's not petroleum, and they don't have to tell us what kind of plastic, what chemicals, what compounds are in it, because it's confidential, because it could hurt them and they won't have a competitive advantage. So like this right here is why I don't believe a damn word they say about climate change. Because if they were really concerned that the planet wasn't going to make it, they wouldn't be doing something so outrageously stupid. So Tara, can you figure out how burning plastic is helping the climate crisis? Am I missing something here?
I mean, it's waste, so.
Yeah. I mean, it's not petroleum, so it's okay. Don't ask questions.
Yeah. This is fucking crazy. So, but here's something that's also crazy to me anyway. So they're looking at population control as a climate change movement. So according to an article in The Atlantic last week, the latest push from climate change activists is telling people to stop having kids because having children is apparently one of the absolute worst things that you can do from an emissions perspective.
Okay, it might be one of the worst things you can do, but not from an emissions perspective.
Yeah, not from a carbon emissions perspective. So there's a climate advocacy group called Project Drawdown, and they're promoting the idea that family planning and education to lower fertility rates is the leading solution to global warming. And this idea goes back to like an age-old concept that was introduced back in the 18th century by Thomas Malthus in Britain, when he claimed that poor people were consuming too many of the nation's resources and overpopulation was destroying the world. So I went on the Project Drawdown website and I looked up their family planning and education section. And like every other government and scientific website, it's totally fucking confusing with convoluted language. But basically, they calculate all of these scenarios pertaining to population control and the environment. And the results of their scenarios predict that if people stop having kids, which they call, quote, voluntary family planning, we can reduce carbon emissions by 68.90 gigatons by 2050. And specifically, the website states, quote, based on our modeling, 55% of projected carbon dioxide equivalent emissions reductions between 2020 and 2050 for the family planning and education solution will occur in lower and middle income countries and 45% in high income countries. So in keeping with the whole, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion narrative, they're promoting this idea of not having kids by saying this is the way to foster equality through family planning as a vital component to achieving higher levels of economic growth, because reducing the population will reduce demands on energy, transportation, materials, food, and the ecosystem, which in turn reduces carbon emissions. Does that make sense? Yes, less people, less everything, right? Less demands on everything. But we've talked about this on the podcast multiple times, and we've already seen so many nations are dealing with problems of underpopulation, not overpopulation. Look at Germany, South Korea, India, Japan, China. All of these countries are dealing with the problem of not having enough young people to work and contribute to economic growth.
Right.
So, is this family planning thing really a climate crisis?
Well, let me ask you this. If everyone stops having kids, then can I keep my Tahoe and gas guzzling vehicles? Because then I might consider it. But again, like, okay, if Trump or DeSantis or someone like that proposed this idea, they'd be calling him Hitler, saying he's trying to like annihilate, races of people. But it's okay if they do it.
Exactly. And then you earlier talked about the ever annoying Greta Thunberg,
Ugh.
and the UN, like in her spirit, the UN has named 7 young climate activists to be part of their UN advisory group on climate change. And it's this team of young leaders who are all like devastated, like Greta is, about the fact that their generation is going to have to bear the burden of all the climate destruction that we have committed and the older generations have committed. So, this group of young people is going to advise the UN on climate actions and policies. And according to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the unrelenting conviction of young people is essential to keep climate goals within reach, lowering fossil fuel emissions and delivering climate justice. Yet, Stephanie, the unrelenting conviction of young people who think it's justifiable to destroy shit and do things like defacing historical buildings and all the priceless art that has been going on in Europe that they're destroying and defacing in the name of climate change, like, is that acceptable? I don't think so.
I think they just want any excuse to just go and like burn shit and like
Yeah.
destroy stuff. I mean, yeah, what is that going to do? Absolutely nothing. So ridiculous. But speaking of the UN, at the 2022 UN summit, where, by the way, there were 400 private jets and they flew in like their chefs and all these exotic meats, that the rest of us are not allowed to eat. But anyway, Al Gore announced a partnership with Google called Climate Trace. If this doesn't sound like fucking doomsday, okay, he's partnering. You've got Al Gore and Google partnering together. Like, Lord help us. But anyhow, it's where they would be able to trace CO2 emissions of countries, factories, and even individuals. Now, this idea originally came out years ago. I think it was in 2015 as a way to enforce UN treaties. But now they're saying that they'll be using the COVID vaccine model with climate change because they saw how much control they were able to exert over people during the pandemic. And so I'm assuming like now they're finding a way to keep that control going with climate change. So much like the Chinese social credit score that we've talked about a lot on the podcast, imagine having an individual CO2 score that the government can penalize you for. And apparently, this is insane. The UN and MasterCard even joined forces, creating a MasterCard that would cut off when you've reached your CO2 limit. And for anyone right now that's saying, oh, that would never happen, it already did. So look at the Freedom Convoy in Canada who had their bank accounts frozen for not complying. And then the other concerning thing, Tara, is that you better bet they'll be using this to track like individual farms and maybe use that as a way to take over like more of the farmland. I mean, I'm just speculating, but I could totally see that being on their list of things. And I actually have a clip. So this isn't from the UN. This is from our favorite people over at the World Economic Forum. And they are talking about a similar way of tracking individuals.
And ability for consumers to measure their own carbon footprint. What does that mean? That's where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? What are they consuming on the platform? So individual carbon footprint tracker. Violet.
Okay, so that they could track everything about us down to what we're eating. That sounds like a great idea. What do you think, Tara? Are you going to sign up for that?
This is, of course, after they take away your vehicles because they're
And
going
your
to track.
guns.
Yeah, your guns. Yeah, that too. They're going to take everything away and then they're going to track you. And what I call it is fucking frightening. And you know how they're all still going to be eating their exotic meats and we're going to be eating bugs.
Yeah.
Apparently, we will also be able to eat mushrooms because according to the latest scientific research, mushrooms are the answer to climate change and solving world hunger. And in Scotland, mushrooms are being declared as the fungal hero that the world needs right now because they are the key to climate change. And sadly, I don't like mushrooms. And I think I actually have a food sensitivity issue with mushrooms. So,
Well, you're going to be eating bugs then. So
right,
get used to it.
right. These are my options. But according to this research, not only are mushrooms nutritious, but growing mushrooms apparently captures carbon emissions and greenhouse gases because planting mushrooms takes away the need to clear extra land to grow crops, and it provides an incentive to planting trees. According to Paul Thomas, an honorary professor at the University of Stirling's Faculty of Natural Sciences, growing edible mushrooms in forests has the potential to capture up to 12.8 tons of carbon for every 2.5 acres of forest every year, which would feed nearly 19 million people. So, in one fell swoop, we can mitigate climate change and make mushrooms a major food group. What do you think about that, Stephanie?
Well, I actually like mushrooms. So, I mean, I'm kind of excited about this. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not excited about this, but I do like mushrooms. I think they're just getting, a little crazy here because next thing you know, mushrooms are going to replace meat. And then people like you are going to have to eat bugs because you can't eat mushrooms. And it's just a whole big mess. And then, like, what kind of mushrooms, too? Are we talking like psilocybin? Like, what kind of stuff are they going to be feeding people? Are they going to drug us all? Or,
Oh
I
my
mean, we
God.
need more details.
They probably are. And the last story that I'm going to talk about here is we talked about earlier these kids that are all, in the UN and helping to promote climate change. And well, now kids are also being diagnosed with climate anxiety. And there was a report earlier this month by CBS News that said one of the biggest concerns among youth is climate change. And research is showing that kids are extremely worried that humanity is doomed, not by war, not by anything real that's
Not
going
by
on.
Russia and China
Right.
and the
No,
US.
but by climate change. And so I guess there was a study late last year that was published where about 10,000 people between the ages of 16 and 25 were interviewed about how they felt about climate change. And 59% said they were extremely worried, and more than 45% said their feelings about climate change were negatively affecting their daily life and their ability to function. 62% said they were anxious about climate change, and 62% also said they were sad and afraid. And higher climate change anxiety in the study was correlated with higher symptoms of clinical depression and anxiety. But the caveat to this was that kids who have high levels of activism don't have as much depression.
Oh my gosh. So go and start destroying buildings and that'll cure your depression. Is that what they're trying to say here?
Yes, especially if you can link climate change to racism, which is what has been going on in Massachusetts. Because apparently there's a high school outside of Boston in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and there's a big group of climate activist youth that go to this high school. And according to one student, Joanna Flores, there's so much jet fuel, road salt, and heating oil on the river that you can't get close to the water. And student Darian Rodriguez, who is 15 years old, said that you wouldn't see that in a white neighborhood because instead you would see a beautiful view of the water. You wouldn't see any industries or smoke or pollution.
Not true. East Palestine is all white people. Trust me. They've talked about that many times. So these kids need to do their research. Go head over to Ohio. This is so ridiculous, but Like, this is what happens when you have the entire mainstream media coordinating with celebrities and politicians to convince everyone that they're going to die because of climate change. And like, I was totally rolling my eyes at this, but at the same time, like, I feel bad for these kids. Like, imagine as a child, every adult, every celebrity, everything you see and hear is that like the world is going to end because of climate change. Like, that would probably be terrifying because you don't know any better. You're like trusting the adults in your life. And, you know, the masses in general have been conditioned since like pre-K to not question authority and to just take everything at face value without due diligence or common sense applied to it. So this is what happens. You get a bunch of idiots that think burning plastic is a viable solution. And like, Tara, at this point, I'm kind of worried we're not going to survive as a species. Not because of climate change, but because of just pure stupidity.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is just a fraction of the articles that we came across. And it's
We
like,
could talk about this like all day long and never run out of topics because it's like there's so many people out there like these kids that are terrified.
so I guess the moral of this episode is save your plastics and donate them to the EPA.
You might get cancer, but you know what? We're not burning petroleum. So it's okay. And it's helping a landfill. It's not helping you and your lungs or the planet, but it's helping a landfill, you know, not fill up with plastic. So yeah, hope everyone out there likes mushrooms. And thanks for tuning in for this very weird Wednesday. And we'll see you back here for our Freedom Friday episode. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you get our latest episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if you could, please rate and review the show. We are going to be reading every single review, and I would love it if you hopped over to Instagram at Unapologetically Outspoken and say hi. We want to see who's out there and start a conversation, plus get all of the topics that you want us to talk about next. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.